Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm so pleased that so many of you decided to join us today. And so today's webinar, my name is Steve Kelder. I'm going to be the host and moderator for the webinar. I'm a professor of epidemiology at the UT School of Public Health and a member of the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Health Promotion. And that center is who is sponsoring Kevin Lanza's, Dr. Lanza's, Lanza, talk today. And so before we get started, I just want to mention that this webinar is being recorded and it'll then be placed on our website afterwards. And so if you miss a point here and there and you want to see it again, just go to our website at the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living and look under the webinar sections. And you'll see not just Dr. Lanza's webinar, but all the other ones that we've done in the last couple of years. And so I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kevin Lanza, and he's an assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology, Human Genetics, and Environmental Sciences at UT Health School of Public Health. And he's at the Austin campus. In fact, he's about 4 offices away from me right now. So he received his PhD in regional planning at the Georgia Institute of Technology and also completed a postdoctoral training here at the Michael and Susan Dell Center at UT School of Public Health. We're very happy that he agreed to stay with us and become an assistant professor after his postdoc. His research explores relations between the environment, health behaviors, and health given the lens of climate equity. His primary aims are to determine the impact of extreme heat on physical activity, something I think all of us know about this summer. Although it's 91 in Austin today, I was expecting over 100 degrees. But anyway, and so extreme heat on physical activity, exertional heat illness, chronic diseases of individuals living in low-income communities of color to develop interventions to improve resilience or adaptation. Ultimately, his research goals inform policies that eliminate race, ethnicity, and class-based health inequities in the face of urbanization and climate change. He acknowledges that the authentic partnership with the community members is essential for health and climate solutions to be truly effective. So this is a great turnout today of people from Austin, Texas, and probably all over the country. Just one last little piece. We'll have a Q&A portion at the end of this presentation, but you can type in your questions in the chat box. And that's my job later on when Dr. Lanza finishes to ask your questions. So they need to be in that chat little box stream of stuff. And so while the questions come in, just let me know and I'll ask them for you. So thank you all for being here, and Dr. Lanza, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kelder, for the kind introduction. And do let me know if my microphone's not working and you can't hear me naturally. And so, yep, over here in the Austin Regional Campus of UT Health School of Public Health. And today I'm going to give a talk on how extreme heat impacts physical activity and what to do about it. So I appreciate you sharing your time with me to hear about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Oops. This talk has 2 main parts. First, I'll start with an introduction, providing an overview of the relations between ambient temperature, health, and equity. And then we'll move into my research, which looks at the relationship between temperature and physical activity of both adults and children. And all of these 4 research projects happen to be based in the Central Texas region. First, I wanted to take a step back and think about what we've been currently experiencing. And weather forecasters back in May had predicted this was going to be a hot summer. Here's a map from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the umbrella for National Weather Service, and they're showing the probability that temperatures were going to be above or below or equal to what was considered normal or average temperatures. They used data from 1981 to 2010 to define normal. And what you can see is most of the United States was expected to be above the normal temperatures this summer. And I think that came true because we saw historic records both for daily temperatures, minimum, maximum temperatures, along with monthly and potentially summer long. This intensive heat we've experienced this summer, along with the political climate, has led to quite a bit of US government investment in heat health resources, including, as of just 2 days ago, the creation of heat.gov. So I recommend looking at this website. Here's the landing page. And the purpose of this white page is to provide some a hub for heat health information to reduce the health, economic, and infrastructural impacts of extreme heat. What caught my eye is in the lower left corner, you can see the current conditions of who across the United States is currently being impacted by extreme heat advisories, watches, and warnings. And so this was pulled a screenshot from yesterday. And you can see it was almost 50 million of our 330 million in the United States. That's about 1 in 7 individuals, or like 15%, that are currently affected by heat advisories, watches, and warnings. It's important to note that what I've talked about in the last slide and this slide are referring to weather. And so weather as a term is the atmospheric conditions you feel in the short term. That's second to second, minute to minute, month to month. But when we talk about climate, we're talking about the average weather over a longer time period. This is years. And so just want to make sure there's that distinction. So if one has experienced an extreme hot day or a unseasonably cool day, that's the weather one's experiencing, but the long-term differences between that and past periods is referring to that climate. Now to look at that climate change. So here is a telling figure from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that shows across the globe, average temperatures have increased over time. It's from 1880 to 2020. It starts at 1880 because that's when our historic climate record was considered most accurate. Anything before then, we didn't have full representation across the globe. This is showcasing anomalies from the 20th century average temperature of 57 degrees. So you can see by 1980, most years were hotter than the average. Not only are average temperatures increasing over time, we're also seeing an increase in heat waves over time. Heat waves are extreme heat events. There's no standard definition of temperature threshold at which a heat wave is considered. Those vary across different places, potentially rightfully so, but there is a simple term. It's 2 or more days of abnormally high temperatures. And what we see going clockwise is that extreme heat waves are increasing in frequency over time, meaning how often they happen. They're increasing in duration, how long they last. They're increasing in season, that means how many days potentially there could be a heat wave. And it's increasing in intensity, just purely how hot it is. So that's what we've seen historically. Now what are we seeing projected into the future? Well, climate models are estimating more extreme heat days under different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. Here we see data from Travis County, Texas, which is where Austin is situated, and it's a number of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, around 35 degrees Celsius. It shows 2 different greenhouse gas emission scenarios and intermediate emission scenarios where greenhouse gases are stabilized by around 2040 across the world through different policies and actions, and then we see a precipitous decline from those policies. High emission scenario is referring to continued gas emissions where policies are not put in place. You can see that in Austin, or Travis County, about 75 days a year in current times are above 95 degrees. Looking out to 2100, that increases about 30 days for the intermediate scenario, but doubles if you look at the high emission scenario. So what are these temperatures that are increasing along with the higher chances of heat waves? What does this mean for human health? Well, if we zoom out and we look at this conceptual framework for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we see the impacts of climate change on health. We see in the inner ring the major climate change impacts, including rising temperatures. In the middle ring, we see what those impacts mean for different exposures, including extreme heat. And in the outer portion, we see what those exposures mean for public health. In this webinar, we're going to just be speaking about extreme heat as the exposure and these heat-related health outcomes. And why are we focusing on this? Well, because it's critically important. Heat is the most deadly weather-related hazard in the United States. This figure here shows the number of annual weather fatalities on average over the past 30 years. We can see that on average, heat leads to about 140 deaths each year in the US. That's more than all other natural disasters. And that may be surprising to some because heat is invisible as a killer. It doesn't have the same physical destruction as you see with other disasters, such as flooding, tornado, and hurricanes. It also affects different populations differently, including the young and the old and those with pre-existing medical conditions. On top of and independent of climate change and its warming, there is another phenomenon that's causing warming. It's called urban heat islands. They're causing cities to be warmer than surrounding areas. That is due to four main drivers. Urban heat islands are caused by high amounts of dark building materials that absorb that incoming sun's energy and re-emit it as heat near the surface. It's also due to the lack of trees, as trees provide shade and evapotranspiration, which is essentially the evaporation of water from plant leaves that cools the near surface air. Cities also have high amounts of waste heat emissions. So second law of thermodynamics is that work in is not necessarily work out, or is not work out. There's always going to be a portion of waste heat, which heats up the near environment. And that includes something like driving or using air conditioning. And then lastly, it's urban geometry. So the building and the physical structures within cities prevents heat from escaping back out into space. Rather, some of the heat is maintained near the surface that affects us. And one must mention that heat is a health inequity in cities across the United States. This image here shows temperatures in Richmond, Virginia. Low-income communities and communities of color disproportionately live in areas characterized by heat islands. This is a product of a racist policy from the 1930s called redlining, in which home mortgage lenders weren't providing home loans to communities of color. That disinvestment we still see today, where these areas have less trees and higher amounts of dark building materials than other areas. These same communities oftentimes are affected by other health issues, as well as environmental lack of resources, which then leads to a magnifier of those health outcomes and effects from these higher temperatures. Knowing that there's these issues happening across US cities, we, as the Austin community, including City of Austin, UT Austin, and UT Health School of Public Health, applied for funding from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to conduct an urban heat island mapping campaign. Austin Office of Sustainability led that charge, and we were awarded funding. And what this was a community science measurement to identify urban heat islands for a portion of Austin. 12 volunteers, including myself, rigged these temperature sensors and GPS units on our personal vehicles. You can see a photo here of one of our volunteers along with that temperature sensor. That sensor and the GPS unit collected data every 1 second while we were driving. This allowed us to map on different driving routes how hot it was in space and time. Each of the 12 drivers drove a different route at 6 a.m., at 3 p.m., and at 7 p.m. on August 7th, 2020, a very hot day. And then through NOAA and their partners Kappa Strategies actually estimated or modeled temperatures that were between where we had actually measured with these sensors. That allowed us to create a spatially continuous thermal profile of the portion of Austin we were mapping. So let's show that in visual form. Here are two photos that show the morning air temperatures of the study area in Austin. On the left-hand side, you see the observed temperatures of those 12 driven routes just in the morning. And then on the right-hand side, you see that spatially continuous map that was created through Kappa Strategies predictions. What you notice is that, let's look at the right-hand map, that there's differences in temperatures. That's the urban heat island intensity. On the top portion, you see the hottest part of the city, which was at least 78.5 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning. And then on kind of the eastern portion and lower half of Austin, you see a bit cooler temperatures. This led to the first study I'll go over today, which was a follow-up NOAA grant-funded project that was awarded to UT Austin, and I'm serving as a subcontract PI at UT Health, where we're understanding how residents experience extreme heat in Austin. We recruited 18 adults from an area of Austin that saw high urban heat island intensity, which you can see in the image. And this community also happened to be majority Latino and economically disadvantaged. Most that we interviewed were female, Latino, and most interviews were conducted in Spanish. And this interview, this instrument was relatively simple. It had two main questions. It was kind of hypothetical scenario. Imagine it's 105 degrees outside. What does your day look like? And what do you see in your community that would make it feel cooler? I analyzed the data from the interviews within NVivo, a software, and I conducted a thematic analysis where I was able to tease out 7 overarching themes from those 18 individuals. Residents were hot when traveling or working. The most affected by heat were children and those with diabetes. Physically, heat caused tiredness, headaches, dizziness, fainting, trouble breathing. Mentally, heat felt uncomfortable and bothersome. To adjust to heat, residents used air conditioning, they didn't go outside, and they changed their schedule. Barriers to being comfortable included AC costs, lack of trees and other shade. And to combat heat, residents wanted trees, parks, water bodies, and water fountains. I also pulled out some quotes that resonated with me, specifically around the impact of heat felt by the community members. I like to be able to go outside and kind of walk around, but there are not a lot of green areas around my neighborhood, so I have to stay indoors. Sometimes my son wants to come walking, but I tell him, no, son, you have to take the bus. You're already walking a little bit and it's really hot. We do not have time to go out because of the hot weather. The day goes by quickly because it is so hot. We want to go out, we do not exercise, we do not walk, we gain weight. Heat impacts us. I get more stressed, I get more tired. I don't feel like going for a walk to de-stress. We take shelter in the house, hoping that the air will keep us cool. It hits us hard because stressed children are also locked in. I also pulled some quotes from residents about strategies they take for heat personally, along with what they wish they saw in their community. With trees planted at the edge of the streets, it feels cooler. There are times when I have to go to the store with my 2 children, and sometimes I have to stand there in the sun. There is no tree for me to rest or for my children to relax, to breathe a little fresh air. At least it's going to feel a little cooler if we have more trees and there are parks with water fountains for the children to play and all that. And let's say roofs so that they can be under a roof and not practically under the sun. On hot days, we end up going to other neighborhoods that have amenities and resources. I guess you can't do anything against the weather. I cannot even imagine a solution for the heat. It seems like nobody's smart enough to know exactly what to do. Well, I do think there are some folks, especially on the research side, that could partner with communities to find out what to do. This brings us back to this conceptual framework where I wanted to add something to this framework. So we've seen through the impacts of heat on these community members that it kind of kept them indoors and kept them from potentially being physically active. So I wanted to add to this that rather than looking at extreme heat purely at the ends of the health spectrum in terms of heat-related injury and death, I thought it important to see if heat serves as a barrier to individuals being physically active due to thermal discomfort. This is a major public health concern because physical inactivity is a crisis in the US and truly the world. In the US, 50% of adults are self-reporting not reaching national physical activity guidelines for aerobic activity. And more alarming is about 20% of children are not reaching these guidelines. We know that physical activity is a health behavior that lowers the risk of cancers, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. This brings us to the second study. This is where in Austin, I looked at observed temperatures as well as projected temperatures, how that would potentially impact trail use by pedestrians and cyclists. Here are some photos of the actual trail. You can see it's a gravel path, it's rather wide, it's a 10-mile loop trail around the center of Austin, and it has some bridge portions. So first with the observed temperatures and trail use. This was, again, a 10-mile hike and bike trail in Austin, and we focus on the full year of 2019. We measured trail users through hourly counts of pedestrians and cyclists measured through what's an urban multi, which is in that bottom photo. It's that galvanized steel post. There's a sensor inside, and it's brought to us by EcoCounter. And so you can see in the top right image the 5 different counters that are placed along the trail in 2019. Those same counters also pull data from World Weather Online from the nearest weather stations. So we have hourly temperature along with hourly trail counts. We then use generalized additive modeling. So it's a non-linear type modeling regression that can look at the relationship between temperature and physical activity. And we adjusted those models for if it rained, as well as if it was a weekday or a weekend. Now, the second part of this project, we were looking at projected temperature, or the impact of climate change on trail use. We measured these projected weather conditions, specifically daily average maximum temperature and rainfall for 2 greenhouse gas emission scenarios, those same mentioned before, the intermediate and high emissions. And we did this for 3 time periods: contemporary, mid-century, and late century. We then combined that estimated exposure response relation from the generalized additive modeling of observed temperature and trail use with those daily projections. So first, looking at the relationship between observed temperature and trail use, we see that in paying attention to the risk ratio above 1, that's when individuals were more likely to use the trail than at other times. We see that pedestrians are the black curve, cyclists are the blue curve. Pedestrians were more likely to use the trail around 40 degrees Fahrenheit to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, while cyclists were more likely to use the trail from around 60 to almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. On the cooler side of this spectrum, we think pedestrians were more likely to be active when it's cooler than cyclists because they can always wear more clothes. They can always bundle up. While cyclists, when they're riding, actually create their own wind called apparent wind, which may actually make them thermally uncomfortable. However, conversely, on the warmer end of the spectrum, we think pedestrians are not able to be in as warm as environments as cyclists because they can only take off so much clothes legally, and cyclists can always create their own wind, which may be more comfortable. And now here is climate change and its impact on trail use as we estimate. And here I'm just showcasing the contemporary time just to mid-century, even though we also did contemporary to late century. And I show it for both greenhouse gas emission scenarios. In both images, paying attention to the left-hand most bars, we see the percent change in trail use for the full year amongst these 2 different scenarios. And we see that there's an overall net decrease by pedestrians and cyclists with climate change. We also see that the warmer months, there's a larger decrease, and there's even some increases in trail use in the cooler months, but that does not make up for the losses in trail use. So based on these findings, we have a few recommendations to promote trail use. One would be programmatic. It would be scheduling physical activity during hours that maximize participation and thermal comfort. That could be scheduling a fitness class during maybe the bookends of the day rather than towards the middle of the day when the sun's out. Second would be developing what I call cool corridors. These are spatially continuous networks of physical activity infrastructure combined with heat management strategies. Here is on the bottom of this image is a rendition of that cool corridor, which the circles or polygons are showcasing, let's say, parks, gyms, basketball courts, while the linear connectors are your paths, trails, streets, sidewalks. And then it would be layered with heat management strategies that have been proven, such as tree planting and reflective materials. The third project I'd like to share is the relationship between extreme heat, shade, and bus ridership. In the United States, we've seen that about 2/3 of those who use public transit walk to or from the station or stop. This means that public transit, for all intents and purposes, is a form of physical activity because of that first mile, last mile phenomenon. So this begs the question, I guess 2 questions really. The first question being, do extreme temperatures lead to a reduction in ridership because of thermal discomfort? And then second, do bus stop shelters, those artificial shade structures, and trees surrounding bus stops, do they impact the effect of extreme heat on bus ridership? Here are 2 images of what used to be my commute to work. On the left-hand side, you see a bus stop, and I promise you that that is a bus stop. There's a what is that? A bench, a garbage can, a sign. On the right-hand side, you also see a bus stop. There's still that bench, garbage can, but now you see artificial shade structures and trees. You also see people. The project took place across about 2,300 bus stops operated by Capital Metro along all of their routes, just during the warm season, April to September 2019. And here's an image of those routes and bus stops. The dependent variable or outcome of interest was total bus boardings during the hot part of the day, each day per stop. The independent variables or exposures of interest were daily maximum air temperature, hot days, which were defined as 97 degrees Fahrenheit or above, which we define based on previous definitions of hot days, being the 90th percentile of daily maximum air temperature. Presence of bus stop, was there a bus stop, was there not one? And then the percentage of tree canopy surrounding each bus stop. This was a rather novel design of this variable in that I show it on the right-hand side. We created a 25-meter radius, 25-meter radius circle from the center of each bus stop, which is shown in that yellow. That's called the buffer. And then we clipped it if that circle ever overlapped with a street, because we didn't expect individuals to cross the street to find shade while waiting for the bus, because they may miss their bus and it might not be safe to cross the street. We also chose that 25-meter radius because that's about a 20-second walk, which we thought was around the amount of time people would take to search for shade. We also excluded buildings from that buffer because we wanted to focus on the publicly available space outdoors that people could actually gain access to. And so we used regression modeling to find that temperature did exhibit a negative association with ridership. So hotter it was, less bus ridership, but it was a modest association, albeit significant. But then we found that our main question, trees at bus stops, not shelters, actually moderated the effect of extreme heat on ridership, giving potential evidence that planting trees near bus stops would protect against ridership losses during extreme heat. However, this is not us saying, no, you should not install bus stop shelters. Really what this may get at is that the majority of those who are riding public transit in Austin may be transit dependent, meaning maybe they don't have another mode of travel, or they have constrained or unavailable resources to change their habits, so they have to use public transit and therefore are quote unquote suffering through the heat to reach their stop and station and then wait at that stop and station for the bus. So we should make environments more attractive to these individuals. So this leads to some recommendations for heat resilient public transit. First, I show tree planting at bus stops. This is a tree plus actually an artificial shade structure. So you can actually combine strategies and see if there's synergies there. And then it's not only about the middle destination of the bus stop or station, it's also about the journey. And so what about tree planting along the routes themselves? There are plenty of bus stop shelter types out there, and these are some photos from across the world, I think 6 different photos. You can see on the top hand side, there are some vegetated bus stop shelters, so why don't we combine the two into a singular idea? I think the middle top photo is of, I think it's the Phoenix Tempe area in Arizona. And then you also see on the bottom left, there's actually a swing. And so that's a way to create one's own wind. So maybe that's thermally comfortable, as well as potentially sneaking in a little physical activity. And then lastly, although not studied here, I am a proponent of adding water mist spraying systems as appropriate to the region and the area. So these systems we have seen in the United States in the sense of outside patios, maybe private homes, along with hotels and restaurants. But where we don't see them in the United States is in public spaces. And so these have been used in Europe and Asia and have been shown through a literature review to cool temperatures by about 14 degrees Fahrenheit on average. That's taking 100-degree days and making it 86. And lastly, I want to share with you the Green Schoolyards Project. This was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded project co-led by Melody Alcazar at the City of Austin Parks and Rec Department and myself. And this is just wrapping up. Here we see a photo from one of the study schools, and what you can see in this photo is tree canopy. You can see a playground. You can see children in the shade. What you cannot see in this photo is it was over 100 degrees this day. Now, one of the impetus for this project was that most children in Texas are not sufficiently active, and there's differences by race ethnicity. Here are some data from the Texas School Physical Activity and Nutrition Survey that's brought to us through the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living, where it shows the percentage of Texas 4th graders meeting the physical activity guidelines. While most children are not reaching the guidelines, we see that Black and Latino 4th graders are less likely than white and all other race ethnicities not displayed here. So this begs the question, is extreme heat a barrier to these children being active due to the thermal discomfort? In the Green Schoolyards Project, we aim to determine how green features, trees, gardens, nature trails at joint use school parks impacted ambient temperatures within parks, physical activity levels of Latino children from low-income households, and how these children's connection to nature relates to their social emotional learning skills. These SEL skills are skills around, social awareness, self-awareness, self-control, along with interpersonal skills that are essential for success in life, school, and work. And so we want to see how we can promote these at a young age. The Green Schoolyards Project focused on 3 joint use elementary school parks in Austin. Joint use meaning that there was an agreement between the city and the school district that the school parks would be open to the public outside of school hours. And we focused on schools that were in areas or that had enrolled from mostly economically disadvantaged Latino households. We focus on 2 weeks in September and 1 week in November in 2019. September because that's a historically high temperature month during the school year, in November because it potentially is more thermally comfortable. We tasked 213 3rd and 4th grade students across the 3 schools with wearing accelerometers or activity monitors, as well as GPS units during recess period. This allowed us to understand how active children were being and where they were being active in space and time. We then measured green features, so these trees, as well as shade, from high resolution aerial imagery brought to us from the US Department of Agriculture within a geographic information system. And lastly, we measured temperature and relative humidity by installing 10 weather stations per park, sited based on different land covers, such as soil, mulch, concrete, grass, and land uses. So a playground versus a basketball court versus a soccer field. We installed them at about 1.5 meters high, about human height, and they collected temperature and humidity every 5 minutes. We measured children's connection to nature through 2 different instruments, but I'll just showcase one here, the Connection to Nature Index, which includes 16 items that are on 5-point Likert scales that you average the 16 items together to get a single score. And then we measured children's social emotional learning skills through a survey that had already been being administered by the school district that included 10 items specific to SEL skills. SEL has been categorized into 5 different competencies: self-awareness, self-management, relationship skills, social awareness, responsible decision-making. And here's an example item on the 4-point Likert scale. We also created an overall SEL score, which was just the average of the 10 items. So for some results from the study. First, we showcase a thermal profile, which we created from those temperature sensors, where we found heat index differed across sites within parks. Here's an example of one of those parks from September 2019. The red area is the hottest area in the park, and the blue is the coolest. We see the red actually reached 114 degrees heat index, which is a combination term for air temperature and relative humidity that captures how it really feels. While in that hottest area in the park is illustrated in that top right photo. That's an unshaded playground. However, the coolest spot in the park reached 103 degrees, or about 11 degrees cooler, and that was a shaded playground represented in that bottom right photo. From those children wearing accelerometers and GPS units during recess periods, we found that as temperatures rise, children decrease physical activity and they seek shade. With around 92-ish, 93 degrees, that's when it inflects, where a larger percentage of time children spend in recess in the shade compared to being in moderate to vigorous physical activity, or MVPA. Lastly, we also found that the school with the most tree canopy cover had 6% more children spent 6% more time in MVPA, or moderate vigorous physical activity, than schools with less tree canopy, giving interest or evidence potentially of green schoolyards being conducive of higher amounts of physical activity. And lastly, we found that children's connection to nature had a significant positive effect on overall SEL skills. That's that average of those 10 items, as well as 3 specific core competencies: self-awareness, self-management, and relationship skills. So this is the power of nature contact. From the Green Schoolyards Project, we have a few recommendations, one of which is to redesign schoolyards for climate health of children. One is to green schoolyards. We've seen that schoolyards may induce physical activity. They potentially provide nature contact that may then drive SEL skill development. And there's a host of other benefits from nature. We find there's a de-stressing component in the literature, along with just biodiversity. Adding shade to areas intended for physical activity. We saw that unshaded playground structure compared to the shaded playground structure. And what could that mean for children in terms of heat health? Add shade to areas intended for rest. We don't expect children to play for 100% of the time. We also don't expect potential caregivers as well, or caretakers, as well as school staff to be standing in the sun while they're outside at recess. And so making sure that there's spaces available for a combination of both. And then changing recess policy, so scheduling recess during more thermally comfortable times of day, but also taking into account that recess is a mental break for children. We don't necessarily want to have recess as the first item of the day when it is cooler, but potentially also not have recess at 3 p.m. when it's the hottest. There should be potentially some training of school staff to organize shaded play on extreme heat days. So this intervention could be some type of programming at the most shaded spaces of one's playground to maximize those resources, such as maybe organizing a Frisbee game in the shaded part of the park. And then there's also the idea of shifting recess to indoor activity spaces on extreme heat days. We don't necessarily recommend this because children only have so much of their time outside, and we know the benefit of children of being outdoors. Outdoors equals activity. It also is the only space that nature is at a level that could potentially provide benefits to the children. And so we more so recommend keeping outside, but finding it to be a safer way to keep them outside. So I want to conclude with just the summary of what we've talked about today. While average temperatures are increasing globally due to climate change, cities are also warming due to the urban heat island effect. All are affected by extreme heat, yet low-income communities and communities of color experience a greater health burden. Extreme heat is associated with lower levels of physical activity of adults and children, and environmental and policy interventions can promote safe physical activity in the face of climate change and urbanization. I want to thank you all for attending today, as well as my collaborators who have worked tirelessly working with my quirks on this research, and without them this would not happen. And I'd like to answer any questions you may have either now with our Q&A time, or if you'd rather think about it for a bit and send an email, happy to respond over that. And I also look forward to just hearing from you all. Maybe we could set up some type of partnership to promote heat health in your area. And so thank you.
Sorry, I had to unmute my microphone. Thanks, Kevin. It was a great talk. I appreciate it. This is an important topic, particularly as we're thinking right now what to do in the summer with our kids, and to make sure that they're healthy and that they can live better outside. And so I'm inviting the group, the audience, to submit questions for the chat. But we don't have any. Just, oh, here's one. What can public health professionals do to make our politicians take climate change seriously? Now there's a big question.
Gosh, that's I think if we solved that, we'd save humanity. I think it's getting out, it's voting, it's going to public meetings, it's thinking local to make changes that reverberate outwards. It's I feel like I'm unfortunately providing canned responses here because it's something that has yet to be solved. I think politicians have their own agenda and they have many forces acting upon them. But I think if we can be one of those forces, then we can potentially create change. And I think it's voting. I mean, voting is at the end of the day is the democratic way to get who we want to be in office. And I also think that it starts with the community voice through stories. I think numbers in a lot of ways, they can numb if they're by themselves. But if you bring in those science-based numbers alongside the stories with very specific details, then I think that's when you move the needle, because politicians that think opposite of climate change, let's say, have almost at a certain point, no choice but to cater towards the want of the people, right? Because then it self-serves them as well. The other idea is to be strategic with our politicians, in the sense of how can we tie in these climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. Adaptation strategies meaning ways that we adjust to the impacts of climate change, such as planting a tree next to a bus stop. Climate change mitigation meaning reducing greenhouse gas emissions, such as shifting from your personal motor vehicle to walking to work. I think that my response here is that with those climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies, it would be knowing that they have multiple benefits. They have all these co-benefits. And so if we sell or promote these strategies, maybe not under the veil of climate change, but instead under the veil of our children's health, I think that's a bipartisan attraction.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Kevin. With one exception, I guess, 'cause I didn't hear it loud and clear, and that's I think all of us have to take a little responsibility by either contacting our elected officials, attending public meetings, or becoming a little bit more interested about personal actions that we can take. And at least in my view, having gone through this process several years ago, thinking hard about what exactly can I do, purchasing cars that have a higher miles per gallon, examining how often I get on an airplane and travel, and do I really need to travel? Things like that keep it up front and in your mind. And when it's in your mind, and when you're making a few challenging, maybe, changes in your lifestyle, then when the time comes, when there's a vote on something, you might be more motivated to send that email or letter to your elected official. So just a thought. But we have another question here. It's about trees. And so I come from one of the most wooded cities in Brazil. And one of the concerns we have is trees falling on cars and homes during the summer storms. Here in Austin or in the South in general, do people care about trees that fall down during storms? Or are there any tree health projects because you can prevent them from being pulled down by a storm?
That's a fantastic question. And I have to be careful with my wording here because sometimes I go too strong in certain directions where trees are not a panacea. They're not a perfect climate change adaptation as well as mitigation strategy in the sense that they can fall. I mean, there's the issue. I grew up in Central Florida where we have hurricanes come through. And that was one of the early memories I have of the health comfort of trees was when all these trees were taken from the area I had lived in and what that meant for the shading in my neighborhood. It just went away. And so did the attraction of the area I was living in. It also, because of the tree falls, we had lost power. So it's the concurrent disasters of it was during the summer, there was a heat wave, we had lost power, and we were coming back from a hurricane. But so to get to your question with trees though, is that they take the largest cost with trees, I would argue, and I think others would, is not necessarily the planting of them, but it's the maintenance of them. Who is to take care of them? Who is to water and trim and make sure that they're staying healthy? Also understanding that in urban areas, trees' lifespan is significantly less than if it were in a non-urban area. So street trees, for example, those are receiving quite a bit of car pollution, and they may not have enough pervious like soil for their critical root zone, which then affects their health in general. And so not being an arborist, but me just saying that trees are one of several strategies we should use and think about using strategies in concert with one another. And so, but with all this to say, we have lost lots of trees. I think it's important to think about which trees are native to our area and how climate change is potentially changing which trees are able to thrive in which areas, which is called their hardiness zones. So that's the average annual extreme temperature in which a tree can grow. And with climate change, we're seeing a shifting of those hardiness zones northward. And so I think it's getting ahead of the curve because you want to have the tree that is meant for that climate. And I think that would affect also the health of that tree and therefore may lead it to be a bit more strong in those hurricanes or rain events.
Great answer. So Kevin, what is the most hopeful finding from your research, the research that you're conducting, or I guess anybody else too? Where do you find hope in this climate change dilemma?
I think I find hope in well, going to give a few answers here, some that are practical, some that are different than that. One would be the people around me that are working on this, some of the brightest people I've ever met. And it's just so exciting to partner with them um, and see what differences they're making across the world. I also see that there is a huge shift in federal funding agencies in terms of interest around climate change and health, in the sense that there now is a vested interest. There's also not a push, but more so a requirement of partnerships between research and community. And instead of this extractive practice that research has unfortunately played for quite a few years. And so I find hope in the direction of co-creation amongst different entities, community members, government, practitioners, researchers. I find hope in this generation that's coming up and what they've thought about in terms of climate change and health, in that it's on everyone's minds. A lot of the positions I was looking for to start my career did not exist out of my college or undergrad. Now they're here, these jobs, and they're happening in the corporate spaces as well, including larger Fortune 500 companies, which, if one thinks about it, that's where a lot of the changes can take place. So I think I'm excited by the energy and the smarts in the room fighting to bring health in the face of climate change.
Good. So here's another one. What were the changes in the bus stops? Or no, I'm sorry. How were the changes to the bus stops and parks financed? Does the City of Austin Cap Metro have plans to follow up on what was learned from your studies? Do you know? Do you know what those plans involve?
Sure, I believe Capital Metro has a report that outlines their guidelines for where they put bus stop shelters. And so there's a criteria that has to be met for any given bus stop as to when it is eligible to receive a shelter, those artificial shade structures. And it's based on ridership amount, so daily ridership, because you don't want to invest resources in a bus stop that may not be there, or sorry, may only be attended by like 2 or 3 individuals a day. I think it's 50 boardings is maybe the daily, but don't quote me on that. But then also it's related to nearby a school. So they have these criteria. But I think one thing we are wanting to, and potentially they're working on, is around temperature and how that affects not only who gets a shelter, but also where is the placement of bus stops. So the placement of bus stops is more or less semi-permanent, in the sense that where you are waiting for the bus, these authorities have the authority to work with community to understand where those are best to be positioned. And so in terms of have they used this research, I do know that they're aware of this research, because the data for the bus boardings that I used from 1 to 6 p.m. across 2019, those data came from 2 employees of Capital Metro who kindly shared it with me. And so I think that we are working with other warm climate cities, such as there's a transit authority called Valley Metro, which is in the Phoenix Tempe area. And we're looking and trying to understand what criteria they're using for bus stop shelter placement. And we're trying to learn from these more or less the hottest city in the US, Phoenix, Tempe. And that's being led by UT Austin, some folks there, and I'm supporting some of that initiative.
So what are actionable items that we can suggest to our organizations, to community members, to reduce the rate of climate change? And how do we frame the message to help them understand that individual actions can have a large impact too?
Wow, this is very timely, because I'm working on a grant proposal now around individual level behaviors and what changes those can make. It is understood that a lot of these collective franchises, such as like the electrical grid and the transportation system at large, you could argue that those are where we're in, like large scale agriculture, those are where the huge changes are going to be made globally to mitigate or reduce greenhouse gas emissions and therefore combat climate change. But these individual level behaviors, they're super important because they empower individuals to make a difference, and they are they catch on like wildfire. So the idea is, I read an article recently around 4 individual level behaviors that make the biggest difference in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Let's see if I can remember them. One is having fewer children. 2 is taking less air travel. 3rd is a plant-based diet, and 4th, I believe, was reducing car trips, or going car-free was what it was. And so notice that of those 4, some of them are more, let's say, elastic than others. I don't think it would be easy public health messaging to tell someone to not have that child. I think plane trips some would consider essential, especially if loved ones are across the country. But then there are 2 that are everyday decisions. That would be not necessarily having to reduce car or be car free, but I think it would be on a spectrum, is that you could reduce your car trips and potentially shift your travel mode from car to either not traveling at all, remote work some days, or it would be shifting to active transportation, which both public transit and walking or biking use no to very few greenhouse gas emissions compared to your personal vehicle. And then the 3rd was that plant-based diet, is that one doesn't necessarily have to go entirely vegan or vegetarian. They can just cut down on the amount of consumption of meat. I think there was a study that said if everyone in the US cut down their meat consumption by 1/4, then it would decrease greenhouse gas emissions of the US by 1%. Now, that's a big 1%.
Yeah, let's not forget it's red meat that has the highest claim on carbon problems, and there are different types of meat like chicken and fish that have a lower carbon footprint. Anyway, what do you think is the main takeaway that we should implement locally, or what should we go out and do right now?
Locally, gosh, I think that would kind of relate to my last response, which is those 4 behaviors, is to have them close to your being. And I think it's, there's words that I'm giving, but also understanding that there's cognitive dissonance. So I think it's taking a look in the mirror and reflecting and understanding which of these behaviors you and your household partake in, and which can be shifted to create climate change reduction. Understanding if there are carbon emission calculators out there, including carbon footprint calculators that do exist, so you can take stock of your lifestyle, and understanding that inherently living in certain regions, you're already at a certain level of carbon footprint. So in a sense, we are all contributing to climate change. It's understanding where you can make your differences, but then also at the same time, seeing how that could be brought to and promoted to others, but not so directly, in the sense of, but it is having those conversations. It is bringing that communication up around climate change mitigation. And so I think what one can do is talking about it, but I don't think it's peddling. I think it's more so talking. It's communicating, it's understanding, but I think it's the wide amount, or the large amount of ignorance that the average individual, including myself, have around individual level behaviors and what they truly mean. Do I wash dishes by hand, or do I put them in the dishwasher? At what point is there a threshold at which point the dishwasher is full enough that it actually does reduce greenhouse gas emissions versus washing them by hand? At what speed in my car should I travel to maximize fuel efficiency, versus at what speed should I use the AC versus keeping the windows open? And what does that mean for drag of the car? And so what I'm getting at are these everyday minutia that add up. And so how do we make change that eventually gets to the politicians, is we start just living the change we want to see. And it may even be taking stock of one's career and where one focuses their efforts, either within their 9-to-5 job or within their supplementary hobbies and activities. And so just making your difference that is not a flash in the pan, but also doing one that could potentially be sustainable, something that works with where you're at, versus doing something that is a bit beyond where your current setting and season is.
Okay, here's a more technical question. In comparison to misting systems, how do fans without misting compare, I suppose, to ones that don't? And do misting systems still work in humid areas or drought impacted areas?
Great question. There are, just like trees, just like shade structures that are artificial, misting systems are not a perfect strategy. They work, they're region specific, and this question asker nailed it with how they asked their question, is that some environments are, the humidity in the ambient environment it will contribute to higher humidity, these misting systems. However, if you think of the heat index, which is that combination term of air temperature and relative humidity, I suspect it would still lower the overall heat index, even though it contributes to increasing the humidity within that index. The misting system has a menu of configurations. You can change the droplet size, you can mate or pair a misting system with the water with the fan, and then you have this synergy that you could have it revolving. You could also have smart logics, which allow it to turn on and off at certain temperature thresholds. That's a bit more intense, and they're working on that. But to get to your point about, to answer the first part of the question, fans by themselves, yes, that is a cooling strategy, because if you think about it, it's not your sweat that cools you, it's the evaporation of the sweat. So having advection or convection and having this wind will actually lead to cooling. However, I think science has shown that at a certain temperature level, when it is a certain hot and you have wind, then you're actually not evaporating sweat anymore, and you're just actually heating yourself up with this hot wind. And so I think wind is also climate specific or temperature specific, let's say. And then lastly, with those misting systems, they use potable water, because you have to use potable, and because this is water that's hitting an individual, and you have to drain the lines and also UV disinfect them to prevent against Legionnaire's disease. So there are some caveats. And then lastly, depends on region specific, there is a water hardness or calcium and other properties within water that will lead to a faster clogging of the misting lines, which will then require more maintenance. And so all of these put together, you have to think, is that 14°F cooling on average worth it? I think it depends on piloting it in the area and for its use. Is it best at a bus transit stop? Where I've heard from Valley Metro in Phoenix that their intention is to move people from those stops as soon as possible through transit, not to have them stay there. So it doesn't actually fit with their theory. And it may actually serve better in, let's say, a recreation center where they actually want people to be spending their time.
Interesting. Here's another one, and we just have a few more minutes for questions, so let's get at it. Have you looked into what other countries like Qatar have done to mitigate extreme heat issues? What do they do differently than us?
Wow. Okay. If we only have a few minutes, I'll try to keep it short. But I know in the Middle East, I think it might be the United Arab Emirates, they have a city called Masdar City, which is supposed to be a new world, highly progressive, built around a technology university. And they took advantage of vernacular architecture. So these previous technologies and styles that have been used for centuries for different benefits, including cooling. So they have wind towers that are normally built within a building structure that actually funnel air from higher altitudes, which is cooler than air near the surface. And they funnel it within this like cylinder, the vertical cylinder, and they shoot it out into a narrow configuration of street level. And that actually cools through a cool wind that's brought through. And the key word is the cool wind, because they even sometimes put cooling devices within the actual cylinder itself. So all this to say is, yeah, I think there's even just to peddle a research solicitation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has global ideas for US solutions specific to climate change and health, I believe. And that would be an idea, is just thinking through. And I think we have to think as truly worldwide, because this is a worldwide issue, climate change, and there are smart people everywhere.
Very good. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. It's a great seminar and a great set of questions too. So thank you for paying attention, audience, and giving us a chance to listen to Kevin answer these questions. You may know that we routinely put on these webinars on a variety of different topics. We are recording this and it will be up on the website. And let me read it. It is pretty simple, msdcenter, all one phrase, .org. msdcenter.org. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.